Hello everyone, my name is Sam Hagan. I am part of the public programming team at the State Library of New South Wales. Welcome to your library at home. I would like to begin by acknowledging today that we meet on Gadigal country. I live and work on Gadigal land and take this opportunity to pay my respects to elders past, present, and of course emerging. I also extend that respect to any Australian Aboriginal people who are joining us here today. Welcome to the latest in our series of online curator talks. Today, we're going to hear from my colleague, Margot Riley. Margot is a library curator and a cultural historian with special interests in art, popular culture, photography, and dress. She's written and lectured widely about the library's collection, and she's curated numerous exhibitions and displays. But today, Margot will be talking about a fascinating photograph from the library's extensive photographic collection. You may know that the library holds over 1 million images covering historical material, family albums, snaps shared via social media platforms such as our New South Wales at Home Insta campaign, which you can still participate in. We also have artworks, photographic artworks, which have been sold for millions and more. If you would like to explore the collection for yourself, the easiest way to do it is to start online. So you can go to our photography stories page, which is www.sl.newsouthwales.gov.au/stories/photography. We'll put that up somewhere or just go online and search stories photography on the website. So that's my little promo for today. I encourage you to take a look at our photography stories, but in the meantime, Margot, I'd like to invite you to join me online. Margot, are you there?
Yes. Hi, Sam.
Hello. I'll leave you to it.
Okay. I also would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation on whose lands we are here, we're meeting today. So thank you all for joining me to go on this little bit of a meander through the collection, find out about just one of the millions of photographs that we have in our collection. So this is a series of talks that we're doing, and it's a fantastic opportunity for curators to just deep dive into an aspect of the collection or their work that fascinates us, and we really want to have the opportunity to share that with you, especially in these times. So there was a period of, within 2007, I was offered a fantastic opportunity. I was the first of the State Librarian Staff Fellows, and the program I had was for 3 months to spend all my time going through the library's collection of portraiture. Now, the idea behind that was that I am a dress historian, so my interest is in how Australians have changed in appearance over time. So how we've looked from first settlement and before, any image that I could find that would shed light on the changing nature of the way people have presented themselves. So it was, as I say, three months of climbing up ladders, going down into the basement, opening drawers, delving into boxes of negatives and sifting through prints and having a wonderful time. And one day I was down in the basement. You can see our photographic basement in the left-hand image, and I came across this image. And I was just immediately mesmerized by this beautiful image of 2 young girls. It had a name on the bottom, Naomi and Jane Nobbs. And immediately, I knew that it was an albumen print, which is a very early form of photography, and I can tell that because of the colour. It is this brownish cream wash, and just the softness of it really immediately reminded me of some of the most beautiful work of a lady photographer by the name of Julia Margaret Cameron. And there was something about the image, and it was also about what they were wearing, because they're not dressed in traditional Western clothing for the time. I knew because it was an albumen print that it's probably printed in the middle of the 1850s, and they're not wearing that sort of familiar Gone with the Wind type frock that we're probably familiar with. They're wearing a very loose-fitting garment. And immediately my mind went, aha, these women are wearing what was known at the time as a Mother Hubbard. And this was the traditional wear, well, not traditional, but it was the type of dress that was encouraged after the contact of missionaries with islander people of the Pacific region. So immediately I could see that there was this fascinating photograph showing two young girls wearing what looked to be missionary imposed clothing known as a Mother Hubbard. I wanted to know more. The other detail that I noticed in the print, and you can see down the bottom, is scratched into the emulsion of the negative, because this image is made by the wet plate photographic process. So wet emulsion is applied to a glass plate, and then the photograph is printed. But before the image is printed, the photographer can actually scratch information into the emulsion. And in this instance, we have the initials MFM. So knowing that the image was by this MFM, given the date, the idea that it was related somehow to the Pacific and the name of Knobs led me to the story of the mutiny on the Bounty. So the Bounty Mutineers, as you're probably familiar, and this slide basically encapsulates the story. We have William Bligh, Lieutenant William Bligh at the time, travelling through the Pacific, and there's an uprising, and the Fletcher Christian and three other mutineers overthrow the captain and take the boat. And then they return to Tahiti from where they've just come. They set Bligh out floating in a boat, and then the men return to Tahiti, where they want to be reunited with the women that they have been spending time with. So the Bounty Mutineers return to Tahiti and find their consorts and decide to sail away from Tahiti and find somewhere safe to just basically get away from the law, because they've obviously broken the law, and if they get taken back to England, they would be probably hung. And they come across the island of Pitcairn. So Pitcairn was discovered by Philip Carteret while he was on an expedition through the Pacific in 1767. It was actually named for Carteret, a young seaman on the boat. But through an accident of charting, the island of Pitcairn didn't actually appear on the charts that were in common use at this time in the 18th century. So it was a perfect haven for the mutineers. They were able to they were able to land on the shore. Everyone was able to go onto the island, and then the mutineers burnt the Bounty so that they wouldn't be seen, and they could hide basically on and live in isolation and security on Pitcairn. They did continue to have contact with other islander nations, but it really wasn't until 1808 that Pitcairn was rediscovered. And not until 1814, when this watercolour was created, and yes, the news got out that the mutineers were still living on the island of Pitcairn, and that had set up a community and had continued to live their lives in the Pacific region. One of the other, so Mr. Shillabere, who was Lieutenant Shillabere, who was in command of the frigate that visited Pitcairn in 1814, also took the opportunity to draw this wonderful image of Friday or Thursday, because he actually found out, even though it'd been called Friday, he was actually born on a Thursday, October Christian. And I might have that the wrong way around. I know it's one or the other, which I think is absolutely a fascinating story. Apparently, when he was born, Fletcher Christian was determined that his son would not have any name that was used in the Western world. So he determined to name his child after the day on which he was born, rather than follow any other form of naming tradition. And so this is a wonderful image that captures the style of dress that was being worn at the time in 1814. You can see there's items of clothing that are probably, cut down. They might be exchanged with passing whalers or other the clothing that has just been adapted over time. A straw hat, and then which was traditionally, hats were really popular. People loved to have it was actually a status symbol. To have a hat, and in this case it's been decorated with this lovely little flourish of feathers. So we're moving quite a way forward now. So between that 1814, 1819 period, there were many ships encountered Pitcairn. There were deliveries of materials and clothing, gifts of clothing came from Queen Victoria to make sure that the islanders were being well clothed, that there wasn't any nakedness or anything going on there. And one of the people to visit the island was the young Matthew Fortescue Moresby. He was the son of the Admiral of the Pacific. His father, Moresby, of course, Port Moresby is named for his father. And in the I'm going to have to just go to my piece of paper. Yes, he was a secretary on his father's vessel, which was, and I'm losing my place, dearie me. Anyway, it doesn't matter. In the time he was his father's secretary and travelling through the Pacific, he visited Pitcairn several times, and he was very taken with it. He really thought he was a young, very Christian young man, and the Pitcairners had really turned to religion in their isolation. They were considered to be incredibly devout, very, very long prayers being said repeatedly. And he said on visiting Pitcairn, I had my piece of paper and it's gone. Anyway, he did describe just how beautiful it was and how much he just enjoyed being there. Really thought it was paradise. And here we have a view of Matthew Fortescue Moresby, or Forty as he was known. He was a talented artist. This view shows you Sydney in 1857, and I realise I put 1957, I apologise. And then the image down below is the Herald, which was a boat that was a ship that was in Sydney Harbour during the time that Forty was based in Sydney in the middle of the 1850s. It's thought that he learned photography from his friend Edward Ward, who was the master of the Mint in Macquarie Street. And Ward was part of a number of young gentlemen photographers that was working in Sydney at the time. And here we have an image. This is actually another of the coterie of gentlemen photographers, possibly taken. The image itself is in an album that belonged to Arthur Onslow. Onslow was a grandson of Alexander Macleay, the colonial secretary. He actually was born in India, but then came to Australia at the age of 5, probably to avoid, to preserve his life, and so he didn't die of any of the childhood illnesses that were taking so many children. So he was sent to Australia to live with his grandfather, and he stayed here till the 1840s when he went back to England, and he eventually also joined the Navy. And unlike the Army was very keen on soldiers taking up photography and having cameras with them in the field to document places and that they were going. Prior to that, military people had been often trained in topographical art because it was part of their job to actually document battles or just new places that they were arriving at. And photography really enabled them to do that task even better. The Navy was not so prone to encouraging photography, but the young Arthur joined up with the other men in Sydney, the other gentlemen photographers who were very much interested in photography. Around about this time, as I've mentioned, the wet plate process had been introduced to Sydney in the middle, about 1855, might have been 54, sorry. The first earliest photographs are taken in Sydney that way. And this is a photograph from Arthur Onslow's album, which is of Tivoli, which if people are from Sydney, they might know is in Rose Bay and is now part of the Kambala School. But in the middle of the 1850s, it was the home of William and Susan Dumeric. And Susan Dumeric was the daughter of Alexander Macleay. So she was the aunt of Arthur Onslow. So it's wonderful to be able to just piece together all these elements from the library's collection. That's one of the joys and the richnesses of our collection. So this photograph actually shows a gentleman with his camera in the garden at Tivoli, and really reinforces that idea that a gentleman who had sufficient education, you really had to know chemistry, who were fascinated by technology and wealthy enough to be able to purchase this equipment, because photographic equipment was expensive. Embraced photography, especially the wet plate process, because it meant they could, with smaller cameras, go outside, take images outside. The development of the stereograph was particularly changed the way people took photography. So the little image that you see, which is the actual on the left-hand side, I've got a detail on the right. The image on the left-hand side is a single frame from a stereographic card. So what would happen is with the stereograph camera, you could actually shoot two images simultaneously. They would then be printed up and pasted side by side on a card. This was then put into a stereograph viewer, and you were able to see in 3D. And this really was a very popular parlour pastime, and certainly amongst gentlemen amateur photographers, very popular way for them to share their images with their family and friends. It also gave them the opportunity to create two copies. So in this period, this was the beginning of copies of photographs. Before that, everything had been an original image, either on glass or on a polished metal plate with the ambrotype and the daguerreotype. But that was the beauty of the glass plate. You could actually, from one negative, print many, many paper copies. The stereograph had the added advantage of giving you two images to then, share. You could give one away or share one with another family member. And this is what we start to see in these early albums where the gentlemen knew each other and they're sharing their photographs between them. So it's no different really in many ways to the way we want to share our photographs online in the digital world. And as I say, often a way to identify the photographer was to scratch your initials into the emulsion on the negative. And this is just a wonderful image, just showing, the idea of that sort of camaraderie of gentlemen coming together, learning about photography, going on photography field trips. They would exhibit their photographs as well. And Forty is known to have exhibited his photographs at the first photographic exhibition of the Royal Photographic Society in New South Wales in 1859. And here's this lovely, charming shot of Arthur Onslow. So this is, again, showing you the difference between taking a photograph outside and then in the studio. So this is taken, outside. It's really equivalent to a snapshot, whereas the shot of Arthur is probably taken in a studio. So this is more, I don't know for sure that it's a professional photograph, but it could well have been taken from a trip to the photographer. The chart on the other side here is also from the same scrap. It's like a scrapbook, this album, because it really is a way of Arthur bringing together lots of different bits and pieces about his travels and people and places that he's encountered and photographs that he has shared with others. And the map has a little line marked in red up the coast of the east coast of Australia, and it's the voyage of the Herald, which travelled through this area of the Pacific in between 1857 and 1860. And that was the voyage that Arthur went on. And it was actually on that voyage that he worked with a man by the name of James Wilcox, who was actually the expedition artist, but he was a photographer. And he trained Arthur Onslow in photography during this voyage. So you sort of get this sense of naval men and going to foreign places, exciting places, and using cameras to take these very, very early, these are some of the first photographic images of our Pacific neighbours. And also, as I've said about sharing, there are multiple copies of these photographs, which I began to find fascinating. The more I looked, the more I could find. And the internet's been fantastic for that. The group of 4 pictures on the screen was actually offered at auction. I don't know who bought them. Unfortunately, the library didn't. So that shows you some examples of the images of the shot on of the Pitcairn Islanders by Matthew Fortescue Moresby. And then the image on the other side is also by our friend Matthew, and it shows Sir William Dennison. Now, Dennison was the first Governor-General of Australia. So prior to his appointment, there hadn't been a Governor-General per se. There had been just governors in different parts of Australia. Dennison was Governor-General from 1855 to 1861, and he brought his family with him. The first album that the image of the sisters is actually from an album of one of Dennison's daughters. So again, another connection. It's been an extraordinary way of finding all these connections. So the image that we see here shows William Dennison on the Iris, which was the ship that Fortescue Moresby travelled up to Norfolk Island on in 1857. And the little caption is Sir William Dennison, KCB, on board the Iris. And this album is in the National Library of New Zealand. So returning to this image, as I say, once I sort of started to put all of those things together, I could unpack what was in front of me, because whilst I could look at an image and think about what it might be telling me, to have the evidence, the actual factual history, really confirms my initial ideas that these are young women who are not wearing Western dress, and also they are descended from the Mutiny Mutineers. They are the great-granddaughters of Fletcher Christian. So we have 19-year-old Anne on the left and 21-year-old Agnes on the right. And as I say, very incredibly rare to have a double portrait of these young women and showing this style of clothing, which was not mainstream fashion of the day. And beyond finding the first photo, of course, I then found a second copy in Arthur Onslow's album. So again, confirming this sharing and swapping of copies of this image between people who were connected to the same event. And also in the Onslow album, it's called the MacArthur album, so I apologise because it's come down to the library through the MacArthur line. Arthur Onslow married into the MacArthur family. there's this one extraordinary set of images. This one is labelled in a contemporary 19th century hand that says Pitcairn Islanders in Norfolk Island, and the men are dressed in a very motley array of cast-offs, slop clothing, which is what naval and seafaring people would be wearing, very cheap ready-made clothing for men, and this is showing you the population of Pitcairn. Life on Pitcairn had become unsustainable, and by 1856 they had been offered land on Norfolk Island, so they agreed, the population of Pitcairn agreed to be transferred to Norfolk Island, and that occurred in, as I say, in June 1856. These are more photographs in the MacArthur album, and several of them have the initials MFM scratched into the emulsion, so taken by Matthew Fortescue Moresby. You can see the MFM is sort of in the lattice work, just running behind the lady that's holding the baby. And we know for a fact that these photographs were taken on the 25th of September in 1857. So again, extraordinary to know who the people are, who the photographer was, and the exact date and circumstances in which these images were taken. And there's the initials scratched into the emulsion, and also some of the detail about who the people in the photographs are. Mrs. Nobbs, so this is the mother of Jane and Naomi Nobbs. And this particular image, through the copy of the album that is in the National Library of New Zealand, I was able to find out exactly who everyone in the picture is, which was wonderful. So we can see from the caption here that we have Jane again, Miriam Christian, obviously another descendant of Fletcher Christian, Quintal, all these names which are the traditional names of the mutineers. I love the note about Jemima Young, who's the woman on the right-hand side in the middle row. In a contemporary at hand, it says that she was 17 stone and aged 25. And again, this pair of images, which I just, once I found that connection to the Onslow album, there was just this richness of other images, and to compare the first image that I had found. And what's wonderful about this one is that amongst the women wearing the Mother Hubbard dress, we have Jane standing behind her mother and her sister, and she's wearing contemporary Western fashion. And there is an explanation for that as well. So this is the sort of comparable, this is the fashion plate from 1857. This is April 1857. It was published in The World of Fashion, which was a series of fashion magazines that was owned by the mother of David Scott Mitchell, who is one of our benefactors and founders of the Mitchell Library collection. And so this is part of the David Scott Mitchell collection, this beautiful fashion plate of 1857's fashion. And you can see, oh, sorry, I went the wrong way. You can see very, very similar that Jane is very much wearing the fashions of the day. And the reason for that is that she had left Pitcairn. Her father, so Sarah Christian, had married George Nobbs, who was a young, came and became a minister, actually. They married in 1829. He came to Pitcairn in 1828. They then had 10 children, of whom Naomi and Jane are just 2 of the 10 children. And in 1852, Nobbs was to go to England to be ordained as a minister. And so he and Jane travelled he went to England and he took Jane as far as Valparaiso because they had a son who was living in Valparaiso in Chile. So Jane was actually living in Valparaiso between 1822 and 1823 when she came back to Pitcairn, which probably explains why she's wearing what would have been more accepted as, contemporary fashion of the day. And I'm going to sneeze. Pardon me. But I did want to return to the Mother Hubbard because I do think it's an absolutely fascinating garment. It was basically modelled on a nightgown, and this is an example from a collection in America. And it was, as I say, brought to the Pacific Islanders by the missionaries. And because female missionaries would have had nightgowns in their luggage, and it was seen as being cloaking, so much more modest. And the name has come to be associated with images of Old Mother Hubbard, which is where the name came. But the idea was, of course, that it would cloak the nudity, but also it was a cool and comfortable garment for them to wear in tropical conditions. And you can see this is just a diagram of how they were made, and the women of the Islander women would make these. They would be given the task and hand stitching, because this is before the sewing machine. The cloth would come either via traders, whalers, or in exchange. They could also have been made out of tapa cloth, so they could use locally created materials, decorated to suit their own tastes and traditions, and then hand stitched. And then this beautiful painting by Gauguin shows that even in 1893, this was still very common, and today many island nations still wear the Mother Hubbard. It has other names, but what we can identify as the Mother Hubbard. So that's brought us to the end of this whirlwind excursion. But I just think it tells us so much. You know, you can encounter an image in the collection, and the journey it could take you on from being in the basement in Sydney all the way to Pitcairn and back again. So thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you so much, Margot. That was fascinating. It's always astounding to see how one photograph can lead down so many rabbit holes. And you guys, you curatorial staff, are so good at uncovering, which makes me wonder how many billions of stories we have.
Indeed, this is just one.
Just one of the billions. We could do an ad. Well, look, that's actually all we've got time for today. So it's just falls to me to say thank you so much, Margot. Thanks for taking us on that great journey with Jane and Anne, who are now imprinted on my brain, as is that photo. And we will see everybody back here for the next Curator talk in 2 weeks' time on, I haven't got the date, but Friday, 2 weeks' time. So we'll look forward to seeing you all then, and have a great day. See you later. Bye.
Bye.